hon, what you doing with your phone?
Do flowers have best friends?
I don't know. Hey, look.
Whoa.
Some answers can only be found in nature. Discover the unsearchable. Visit discovertheforest.org to find a trail near you. Brought to you by the United States Forest Service and the Ad Council.
On September 17th, 2009, 24-year-old Mitrice Richardson disappeared without a trace in the woods near Malibu, California, and was never seen alive again. I'm Katherine Townsend, host of the podcast Hell and Gone. We're going to try to find out what really happened to Mitrice Richardson. School of Humans and iHeartRadio present Hell and Gone Season 3. Listen to Hell and Gone on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
The world of politics has been fertile soil for stand-up comedians and comedy writers for as long as politicians have existed. Some of the funniest late-night talk show monologues and sketches have drawn on the ridiculous and hypocritical behaviors of elected leaders. When comedian Jon Stewart took over hosting duties for Comedy Central's Daily Show in 1999, he elevated political satire and comedy to a level never before seen. By the time he left the show in 2015, research had proven that not only did more Americans under the age of 30 get their daily news from Stewart and other satirical news programs like his than from any other news source, but viewers of such shows tended to be more educated about the facts surrounding current events than viewers of any actual news program. Across the Atlantic in the UK, the hit television series The MASH Report has met with similar success, satirizing the machinations of UK politics and recently the fallout of the UK's Brexit referendum. And now, the host of The MASH Report, comedian Nish Kumar, has stormed the US shores with a new program, Hello America, that offers a refreshing take on the dramas and tragedies going on in America through a British lens, oftentimes finding uncanny parallels between the political developments in both the UK and the US. I'm Clay Aiken. This week, Politicon welcomes UK comedian Nish Kumar to discuss those parallels and his new show on Quibi, Hello America. Hello, Nish Kumar. How are you?
Good, Clay. How are you?
I'm doing well. I got to tell you, honestly, the producers of this podcast have never been more excited about a guest that we have had on this show than they have been about having you on. And I got to tell you, when they first told me that they wanted to have you on, and they've been wanting to get you to Politicon for years, and they've wanted to have you on the show, I thought, okay, well, and now I'm pretty pumped myself because you're funny.
Oh, good.
and it's really.
I was just going to say, this is not my ideal is to go in with expectations very low. So if I can do,
That's
if
how
I
I've
can do anything
life.
to.
Well, then listen, in that case, I thought it was horrible. It was just, I have nothing but, I've been dreading this episode all week.
Perfect. Now expectations are on the floor. This is when I thrive.
Well, there you go. We're both the same way. How are things? You're in London right now. How is life in London in the middle of this whole pandemic thing? Or is it locked down there? Does it feel weird?
We're sort of in a, I tell you, Clay, it's not quite clear where we are anymore. Our government has not, clarity is not our government's strong point in terms of communications, which is sort of not ideal when what they're trying to communicate is the financial budget for the next year. But I would say it is actively a disaster zone when what they're trying to communicate is how to avoid dying of a global pandemic. And at the minute, we're in a stage where we're not in lockdown, but we're not fully out of lockdown. So restaurants and bars are open, but with heavy restrictions on how many people can be inside at any one time. And they've relaxed some of the kind of social gathering elements of it. But we have been having the odd localized lockdown over the last couple of weeks. And I suspect strongly there'll be a couple more of them to come in the next couple of weeks as well. It's also extremely hot here, which for other people might not be a problem, but for British people, we cannot handle the heat. We cannot manage.
And you don't have air conditioning much, do you? Most people don't have AC inside.
No, we've got no AC, and all our houses are built to retain heat. And as soon as the temperature goes over something in the region of 70, we all start losing our minds and start consuming vast quantities of lager with no shirts on. So, like, I'm not sure how the heat wave is going to tally with our compulsion to do that. So at the moment, we're okay.
That sounds like that's really the special relationship between America and England. The shirtless drinking. That's where we bond probably the most.
If Thatcher and Reagan had done that ballroom dance, both topless, drinking beer, it would have been more representative of the relationship between our two countries.
That would have been quite the step in the Cold War.
Quite the step.
I've got to be honest with you, that would have probably made it a little more chilly. But are people listening? Are people following the directions there? Is there a sense that people are concerned, or is it? I mean, here in America, and I'm sure you've paid attention to it some because you've got your show on Quibi, Hello America, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But here in America, it's very political. People tend to be very guarded and very careful about following guidance if they are supporters of Joe Biden or Democrats. Yeah. And unfortunately, a lot of people who are Trump supporters tend to have followed his guidance more or followed his example more, and not been really all about the masks. Is it political there also?
There's an element of that. There are people who are trying to culture war our response to it. And there's definitely an element of, I guess you could sort of, if you're trying to roughly create analogies between us, our sort of pro-Trumpers tend to be pro-Brexit conservatives. And, that there's elements of the hard right-wing press that is trying to cultivate a culture war around mask wearing and observation of social distancing. However, the thing that complicates matters for them is that Boris Johnson got it. And I think that is why lots more people are taking it seriously than I think they'd otherwise be doing. Because Boris Johnson actually took the decisive leadership maneuver to lead by example and contract coronavirus, possibly.
And he got it. And a bad case of it too.
He got it extremely bad. There was a sort of concerning period where he'd obviously got it, and regardless of your political persuasion, your first thought is, well, I hope he's okay. And all the information seemed to be that was coming out of the government was that he was fine. And then Dominic Raab, who's our Foreign Secretary, is our Secretary of State, who was sort of deputising for him at the then daily coronavirus briefing, said he's absolutely fine. And then he was pressed again and he said, I haven't spoken to him for about 3 days, but he's absolutely fine. And at that point, everyone was like, oh my God, we have no prime minister. This is a disaster. But I think because of that, lots of his supporters, who I think might instinctively have been up for a sort of mask-based culture war, haven't been able to go down that route. Because you can't claim something's a hoax if your number one guy came down with a severe case of it.
Right. Do you you mentioned the right-wing press. I get Sky News here in the US. So I'm able to watch that because it's available. And I've heard so many people who I know from England, friends of mine there, who have said, "Oh, that's the right-wing media, that's the right-wing press." And I get into this, I scratch my head about it, because when I've watched Sky News, and I kind of am nerdy enough to follow the UK elections quite a bit, you don't have opinion journalists so much on any of your news networks there. And I guess maybe that has something to do with some regulations that are in place in England. But where is the right wing or left wing media propaganda type stuff coming from there? I mean, is it coming from the news networks or elsewhere?
No, the real heartland of our partisan news is in the print media. That's really the, and I guess, and their websites of those print media. The real, where our version of Fox News exists is in newspapers like the Daily Telegraph, which is a kind of, broadsheet conservative newspaper, and in the one that may be familiar to American audiences, although not necessarily because of the news, is the Daily Mail website. Now, the Daily Mail website, I believe, is one of the most visited news websites because it has quite a prominent showbiz section. Right. And that thing, I think, is engaged with on a global scale. But over here, the Daily Mail really is the home of that's where you go for your, for the uncle that you avoid at family gatherings. That's where he gets his news from.
And so that's an effective way for politicians to appeal to folks there. I mean, print is sort of dying here in America. Our local papers are not as successful, but you're saying it works there.
Well, we've still got web newspapers that have, our local media doesn't really exist anymore, but our sort of national newspapers are hemorrhaging cash, but I think their websites still have quite a lot of traffic. And, the most read newspapers here are the Daily Mail and the Sun. And the Sun is a Rupert Murdoch owned tabloid. And they're both that's really where you go for the spicy opinions. It's how I can best describe what's contained within those. The Daily Mail is Fox News's angry grandfather.
Well, you really have seen, correct me, and I'm going to, so much that I do want to talk to you about your show and politics in America and how they compare to the U.S. and whatnot. But one thing, since we're talking about Brexit, let me ask you to stop for just a second and give listeners just sort of a Cliff's Notes brief understanding of what Brexit is. We know Brexit means the UK left Europe, but I think for a lot of American listeners, at least, there is a distance between what really happened and what we think happened. Can you explain what happened in the UK in 2016 there?
Yeah, basically in 2016 in the United Kingdom, our entire country basically soiled its pants. And instead of acknowledging that we had soiled our pants, we said, no, we did not. This is what we meant to have happen. And in order to prove how okay we were, started doing some vigorous lunges. That's the best, catch-all.
I have visualized that far more than I should have.
Yeah, that's the best catch-all for what I can describe. And now we're, on the surface, from the sort of waist upwards, we're really grinning through it as we continue to lunge. But if you take more than a second to look at us, we are absolutely covered in feces. The sort of long and short of everything is that we were part of a political union called the European Union, which is a union of 27 European countries. So it wasn't the whole of Europe. It was a political and economic union that was made up of 27 member states. And we have sort of had a really complicated relationship with that social and political union for a long time. So some of it is actually all covered by a single currency now. Countries like France and Germany gave up their currency and took the euro. We never took the euro. We maintained the British pound. And we always had a sort of fractious relationship with this. As they saw a closer union, we sort of always had a slightly contentious relationship with it. But, as with the Trump vote, it's very difficult what's very interesting about it is that the conversation about the European Union should be quite dry because it should just be all about trading relationships, tariff relationships, and sort of movement of people across borders. But actually, it became something slightly more than that. And at least part of the vote, and it's hard to describe the vote as one single entity because there were lots of people who would vote for the Labour Party, who were our centre-left party, would be roughly analogous to the Democrats. Some people who vote for that party would also have voted for Brexit because there was a section of the British political left that always saw the European Union as a way of consolidating neoliberal economic policies. And then there was a section of British society that always felt that the European Union was an imposition on British sovereignty. And then there was another group of people who were kind of riled up by years and years of anti-immigration sentiment. Because the one thing that being in the European Union did mean is that we had it allowed for the free movement of people across the EU. And so for the last kind of 20 years, really almost my entire adult life, immigration from the European Union has been blamed for absolutely everything. And if I was to give my version of events, I would say that all of that was pumped full of steroids by the 2008 financial crisis. And obviously, immediately after a financial crisis, the populace is always more susceptible to anti-immigration ideas because it's a very convenient scapegoat. And I would say that really is how we ended up voting Brexit. That's a significant factor in the Brexit vote. And yes, so we're now in a position where we voted to leave in 2016. And basically what happened quite quickly after that is it became clear that the people who wanted Brexit had not had a conversation about what it would involve. And, we pretty quickly did something called triggering Article 50, which is the official mechanism that allows us to leave without doing any of the due diligence. And so we set ourselves a deadline, which was supposed to be 2 years, but obviously has just keeps getting kicked further and further down the road. And now at the end of this year, we officially leave the European Union. So that'll be some 4.5 years pretty much after the vote happened. And if we can't agree a covering deal that gives us a trading relationship with Europe, we will leave on a no deal, which means we would default to WTO tariffs. And all reasonable economic projections suggest that will create an absolute disaster of a recession. But the joke's on them. Because we handled COVID so poorly, as of today, we've just found out we are in the worst recession since records began. So
it doesn't matter.
No, so it doesn't matter. You know what? We may as well just, start smashing things up in the street and, hand over turn the Houses of Parliament into an enormous strip club.
There was a lot of concern because there have been a few benchmarks in this. There was the Article 50 triggering, then there was a period in which some sort of preliminary deal had to be made, a determination as to whether or not Parliament would accept the deal that Theresa May tried to make, and they didn't, and then accept the deal that Boris Johnson tried to make. And now there's something happened in January of this year, correct? You actually left some part of the union, but not officially. Explain that.
We basically, what we then needed to do after triggering Article 50 was set up a withdrawal agreement, which is pretty much just the divorce bill. It doesn't actually cover a future trading relationship. It just settles our tab that we owe for being part of the European Union. And Theresa May, who became Prime Minister, because David Cameron was Prime Minister, then after Brexit, he campaigned for Remain, so he felt like he had to leave. She took over and she sort of, it became quite... Well, she was a Remain campaigner, and then she switched to kind of being quite a hard leaver. And she was never really able to marshal the sort of hard right of the Tory party. And she then tried to do this withdrawal bill that everyone hated. Like, she managed to do something. She really managed to unify a divided country in that everyone thought that it was absolutely a useless piece of nonsense. But so then she kept bringing it back, and I assume she changed the font every time. I think she came back with one version that was like, this is in Helvetica, and everyone was like, we don't care. The next version she brought back, she made every third word italicized, I think, and everyone was just like, no, this is still a problem. And eventually she came to a point where she felt like she'd run the end of the road and had to step down. Boris Johnson took over, and he, he's the British Trump in the sense that he's, like Trump, is the incarnation of the worst elements of your society. Boris Johnson is the incarnation of the worst elements of our society. And he sort of took over, couldn't get the deal through Parliament because they had quite a thin majority. So then called an election on the basis that he had, and this is a direct quote of the phrase, an oven-ready Brexit deal, and he was ready for it to go. And then in January, they passed the withdrawal bill, which settled our divorce bill from the EU. And then the idea was that over the course of the next 12 months, which is what happens after you pass the withdrawal bill, you've got 12 months to rebuild your trading relationship. And it turns out that Boris Johnson's oven-ready Brexit deal was actually, it wasn't a Brexit deal at all. He put some sushi in an oven. And so what we're now left with is a bunch of burnt fish and rice that no one knows quite what to do with. And so as things stand, we're still heading for a no deal.
So let me ask, as I listen to all of this, I'm sitting here trying to draw some parallels to the U.S. and the situation here, and I think a lot of people sort of speculated back in 2016 after Brexit happened. I think a lot of people, correct me if I'm wrong, in the UK were surprised by the results of the Brexit vote. Did not expect that Remain would lose. Certainly. 4, 5, 6 months later here in the U.S., we found ourselves a little bit with our pants down because we did not, certainly Hillary Clinton did not expect that Donald Trump would win. And it's sort of that same sentiment, the same population demographic of people who voted for Brexit, who had been, to use maybe their words, Nigel Farage's words, fed up with the status quo and the way that relationship had been going. That same demographic here in the U.S. was having the same frustrations. They were upset about immigration. They were upset about some of these more identity politics type issues. And they sort of rose up and put Trump into office. And then I think as you're talking about Theresa May and David Cameron, I think about something that I've said to my fellow Democrats a few times. Is there a time ever, now that you've got Boris Johnson in office, I ask Americans now that Donald Trump is in office, do you ever look back and say, man, maybe we should not have been so pissed off at David Cameron and Theresa May? Do you think that it's possible that conservatives, Tories in the UK felt like, okay, well, Theresa May was actually a Remainer and the Labour Party hated her. The next place we can go is to a level 11. We were at a 10 when Theresa May was there, and Boris Johnson is an 11. Do you think that had played any role in bringing him to power and putting him in a position to win the leadership of the Tory party?
I mean, I think with Johnson, he's a sort of interesting figure because he was a journalist who then became a politician, but the sort of overlap I think between him and Trump is that they were both, to some extent, facilitated by the entertainment industry in the same way that Trump was, but he was always seen with some suspicion by the right of the Conservative Party, and so by coming out in favour of Brexit, he kind of quietened his doubters in the Conservative Party, because he was seen as being in favour of Brexit. I mean, if you
keep on saying things that sound just like Trump. He was a Democrat for years before he became a Republican. So it's all
there's total overlap for sure between the two of them, and there's definitely an element of that. And I think he sort of emerged as the only viable candidate because the rest of the kind of pro-Brexit MPs didn't really have the same name recognition as him, and the ones that did had name recognition for being lunatics. And so it was a happy thing where he was like he was the most famous politician in the country, and he was in favour of Brexit, and so they essentially he nearly became prime minister when Theresa May became prime minister, but there was a sort of shenanigans between him and another pro-Brexit MP called Michael Gove, where they ended up sort of essentially reservoir dogsing each other out of the contest, and Theresa May was the only one left standing.
Do you think that part of the Labour Party's problem had something to do with the leader that they had chosen for themselves through all of this?
Well, he was Jeremy Corbyn was certainly a sort of a divisive figure. It became a divisive figure in Britain, and some of that is because essentially, if you're anything to the left of Margaret Thatcher, the tabloid press will essentially paint you like you're Che Guevara. I was so fascinated watching the coverage of Kamala Harris today on Fox News and seeing, an ex-prosecutor described as a kind of somebody who's basically going to legalize mass orgies in Target. And in fact, not even legalize them, make them mandatory.
Those are already legal in certain states in the South. So actually required for entry, I believe, in South Carolina. The reason I asked about Jeremy Corbyn is because I think that there was certainly a push here in the U.S. From the left of the Democrat Party to nominate somebody like a Bernie Sanders. And there was also a push from moderates in the Democrat Party to say, if we want to beat Donald Trump, or if Democrats want to beat Donald Trump, then we need to look for someone who can appeal to a middle ground. Do you think Keir Starmer, who took over for Jeremy Corbyn, who took that spot, do you think he falls in the more moderate area of the party, or do you think that he is still a pretty progressive liberal leader for Labour?
Well, I think Starmer falls from the more moderate end of the party. I mean, again, you're sort of looking at it. The problem that Starmer is going to have is keeping the left of the party happy. And I think what's interesting is that Biden was obviously, of all of the candidates, arguably the least popular with the left of the Democrats. And I think one of the smartest moves that they've made is to adopt a policy platform that I think is designed to, in many ways, keep the left of the party happy. And I think it's going to be such a fascinating balancing act. It's going to be a fascinating balancing act for Keir Starmer, but because of the fact that we had an election in December, he's got at least another 3.5, 4 years to work out how to make that balance work. Whereas the fascinating thing for Biden is going to be balancing a progressive policy platform that excites and animates voters from the left of the party, who I think there's probably a very real danger of people staying home and sitting the election out again. And also fending off that accusation from the right of Trump that he's essentially going to be, that Biden is basically going to be Weekend at Bernie's by, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Karl Marx.
After you listen to today's podcast, here's one to add to your playlist. I'm Christian O'Connell, and I've had this thought for a while. What if you took the world's funniest and most interesting people and asked them to share the stories behind their 3 most treasured items?
When you said the idea, I thought that's a really good idea.
No doubt about it, the guitar. I think I know the same chords now as I did when I was 14. You know what I mean?
From iHeartRadio, this is The Stuff of Legends. Add it to your playlist for free. Just search for Stuff of Legends in your podcast app.
I knew they were going to kill him. Police ain't FBI.
This is Fight Night, a new podcast from iHeartRadio. This is the story about 2 guys from opposite sides of the street. A hustler blamed for robbing the most dangerous gangsters in the country.
This is like issuing a death warrant for me for something that I don't even know anything about.
And the cop who tried to save his life.
They thought he had robbed the deadliest man in this country. Guys who would not hesitate to blow your head off.
In 1970, Muhammad Ali triumphantly returned to the ring. At the hustlers' party that followed, gangsters from around the country were robbed of $1 million. This story from Atlanta, Georgia, has been reported for 50 years. But now, for the first time, you're going to hear what really happened from the people who lived it. Listen and follow Fight Night on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Right. So let's talk about your show on Quibi, because it's kind of exciting to me, because I have long seen, as we've been talking about here, so many warning signs coming from the UK. All these parallels we're talking about, all of the similarities between the way Democrats sort of attacked the John McCains and the Mitt Romneys, and then were stuck with the Donald Trumps to compete against. The way that the Democrats in the U.S. Considered someone who was more progressive and settled on someone who was more moderate, in the same way that, so many parallels. And so it's very fascinating for me to be able to listen to your take on U.S. politics. And that's what you're doing in your show for Quibi, Hello America. Tell me how that works, and why if you see the same parallels, and what you find fascinating about American politics that made you want to do a show like this for America. American audiences?
Well, I mean, look, there's, in Britain, we're always enthralled to the States. There's no doubt about it. We try and pretend that we try and affect a manner that suggests that we feel some sort of superiority to you. But the truth is, we grow up absolutely fascinated by American culture and the American political system as well. And, even in the way that we depict our various leaderships in popular culture, it just means that, I watched all of The West Wing when I was a kid. And, some of my favorite comedy was the stuff Jon Stewart did on The Daily Show. And so there's just always been a kind of residual fascination for me with the American political system, because there's so much, we've always had so much in common, and yet such sort of viscerally different politics in so many ways. I mean, we, for all of our sort of slide to the right in the last 10 years, for example, on the issue of healthcare, the one thing you cannot do in this country is criticize the National Health Service, which is our, a version of what you would call socialized medicine. And so there's always these kind of fascinating touch points and convergences and divergences. But in terms of this specific show, after 2016, I sort of couldn't believe that the early warnings from us were not heeded in the States. It's so fascinated by this sort of Thelma and Louise style collapse. We put our hand out and you took our hand and then we drove off the cliff together. Yes. It was an extraordinary act of commitment to the special relationship, if I may frame it in that more positive light. But so I think the idea has always been really interesting to me. And also, when I was sort of 16, 17, in the kind of turn of the century, I was watching a lot of British people talk about America, and there was a very, it was the era of George Bush, and, it was a very sort of lazy thing to do, to write comedy about politics that was just well, America's, these guys are all really stupid. And I think one of the things that we wanted to do with this show, because it's really born out of the events of 2016, is kind of definitely look at the ways in which our political systems diverge, but also, I don't want to say celebrate our similarities.
Right. Well,
I don't think there's many things about the things that we've been doing similarly that should be celebrated.
There's so much feces, as you were saying.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, it's a fecal cyclone, Clay. Let me tell you something. Oh, it's a swirling vortex of human waste product. But at least I think express some solidarity with the sections of American society that can't believe what's happened to their country. Because there's definitely a lot of people here that can't believe what's happened to our country. And sort of remind you guys that you're not alone in this. And remind ourselves that we're not alone in this. It's really about an expression of solidarity between the people in both our countries that can't fathom how badly things are going. And I mean, that was, this... Sorry, you go. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, all of this was, it is a sort of long-term development out of Brexit and Trump, but I don't think any of us could have foreseen that we would be back here in the same boat in as devastating a way as we have been in the same boat, in terms of the absolute ineptitude of our government's response to COVID-19.
I mean, having leaders who a good chunk of both countries believe. I mean, we have to concede that there are still nearly 50% or 45% of the U.S. who does support Donald Trump and enthusiastically, but there's a big chunk and a very vocal chunk here in America that doesn't. Does that make it easier for you as a comic to have something to? I mean, Fox News ratings tend to go up higher when there is a Democrat in office. MSNBC's ratings have gone up a lot more here in the U.S. while Trump has been in office. Does it make it easier to be a comic when there are politicians like Boris Johnson or Donald Trump who you are able to make fun of? Is it in a way a little bit of a gift to your, at least the career part?
The only thing that I would say is a gift about both these people, it's not really about them, to be honest. It's more, what's happened in the last 4 or 5 years is that you don't have to, when you're doing comedy about politics, even when I was doing it sort of 6, 7, 8 years ago, you'd sort of have to explain who everyone was. And you'd also have to convince, and I'm talking about really doing comedy in comedy clubs, but you'd sort of have to convince a group of people that were out on a Friday night looking for a laugh and a good time why they should listen to you talk about politics and then do the jokes off the back of it. And now, for sure, even when you do comedy on a Friday or Saturday night, the audience is much more engaged and is much more aware of who you're talking about and understands the stakes much more. There's definitely a higher engagement with politics that that's just evidence that I'm collecting sort of anecdotally from doing comedy.
Do you have to worry when you go into a comedy club and walk out on stage? Do you ever have to worry about the fact that, maybe the audience is more Tory tonight than I want it to be?
A man unplugged my microphone. A man was so incensed by my comments about Brexit. This would probably be in November 2017. A man was so incensed that he unplugged my microphone. Well, he called me the C word, which I understand is I think it's possibly a worse word culturally in America than it is here, but it's still the worst word here. But he said, "You, sir, are that word." And I just think if you use that word, you have invalidated prior use of the word sir. Like, why have you bothered opening with formality? And then one of his friends found the thing in the tech booth and unplugged my microphone.
I got to say, that is still a much more dignified British way to protest than what might have been done here. Because usually I think in the US, something would be thrown at you. At least they just unplugged the microphone. I mean,
well, to be fair, that's also happened to me.
Okay, well, there you go.
At the back end of last year, I was doing a kind of charity fundraiser with quite a sort of well-heeled right-wing crowd. And a guy threw a bread roll at me. And again, it's hard to not make out that we are a fake country when even our riots sort of involve fancy bread snacks. But yeah, it then made all the papers the next day. It was because I think, at the time I thought, well, this is quite funny. And then for the next sort of 24 hours, it was, I basically tallied all of it. There were over 10,000 words written across about 5 major British news publications about me having had a bread roll thrown at me. And,
well, listen, no press is bad press.
It turns out some press is bad press, but it was so there are times where it goes badly, and that's sort of the risk you take when you. I don't. This is going to sound slightly weird. I don't have negative feelings towards people who boo or throw things.
Well, you have to learn to get used to it at some point. I mean, when you choose to be political, don't you just? I mean, I'm assuming you don't change 100%. Your act considering based on your audience, the things that you say or how you feel.
No, because I'm a big believer in free expression, and I think throwing things maybe crosses a line because I don't think you should physically threaten people, even if it is yeast based. But I'm trying to give up bread. That's as much of a threat to me as anything else. But I think booing and stuff is kind of, I think that's the risk that you take if you talk about contentious subject matter like politics at the moment. And it is such a febrile, partisan time that you do run the risk of doing that. And I don't really have that many negative feelings about people. But just to answer your previous question in terms of is it easier to do? I think it's easier to do comedy about politics because people seem more engaged, certainly in this country. I think in some ways it is harder to do comedy about, look at Veep, for example. So Veep is, right. It's not really a remake. It's a kind of American evolution of a British show called The Thick of It, which here was about political spin doctors. And obviously there is about the vice president. And you kind of look at the concept of Veep was what happens if you have a foul-mouthed, ambitious, but without any sense of political responsibility, group of people at the apex of American political power. Now, the problem is, how could you possibly do a post-Trump Veep?
Well, I will say this, even pre-Trump, when I ran for Congress in 2014, House of Cards was really popular here in the U.S.
Of course.
Veep was really popular.
Yeah.
I had to stop watching Veep because it was so accurate. It made me uncomfortable. It was so authentic to what my experience running for Congress was like. House of Cards, on the other hand, and West Wing are so unrealistic. Nowadays, that I don't find them to be. They don't concern or bother me anymore. Veep is about the closest to authentic that I think we've gotten in America on TV in ever. Do you think that entertainment has the same power to change people's minds as it used to? I mean, I think about growing up and sitcoms here in the U.S. that I watched when I was growing up, and they'd have a very special episode where Arnold's dad on Different Strokes was an alcoholic, and you would learn about shows had the power to change people's minds and expose them to different points of view in certain ways in the 80s, the 90s. Do you think that entertainment still has the power to do that, or do you think that entertainment tends to speak to its own demo?
I feel like more and more now it speaks to its own demo, and I don't necessarily think that that's a political thing. I think that's more to do with how we consume entertainment. You know, in this sort of 80s and 90s, you had shows like, the kind of special episode sitcoms. Things like Different Strokes or All in the Family or MASH or any of these kind of enormous cultural juggernauts. The ratings that they were pulling in and the kind of penetration and cultural impact that they had. But now there's just more, there's sort of lots of different media outlets. And so I think things have just naturally splintered off. So I do think it's hard to get something that really crosses cultural boundaries just because of the nature of the way that we consume media. But I do think that there are occasions where something can have a kind of something can really. I think it's sort of when kind of I think when someone like John Boyega makes a massive statement, goes to a Black Lives Matter protest and speaks out about it, I think that still has a kind of big impact because, he's in Star Wars and everybody loves Star Wars. And so I do think there are these kind of little flashpoints. I think when Beyonce makes a kind of explicitly political statement, as she has done on several occasions in the last few years, it does resonate because it sort of does cross a lot of cultural boundaries. But I think it's harder and harder to do. But I definitely think that's more to do with the way that we consume media.
When you're writing your material, do you hope to be able to reach people or change people's minds, or that's not a goal for you?
You definitely hope. You definitely, you do always want to put an argument or a perspective forward that you feel if somebody who disagreed with you watched it, they would, or you want to do stuff that's funny enough that even if someone doesn't necessarily agree with it, they can still get a laugh out of it. And so you do try and keep that in mind where possible. But we are also aware that just by virtue of the type of show that it is, we're probably going to be playing to quite a sort of limited, like a sort of narrow demographic. But you do try where possible, to try and at least put over, we're always very conscious of we don't make stuff up. We fact check stuff and we try and make sure that when we're making an argument, it's substantiated. And we try and make it as funny as we can. And, with the sort of hope that if somebody who fundamentally disagrees with what we're doing watches it, they at least get a laugh out of it. But we're also aware of, it's a show making comments about American politics hosted by a British guy. And so by virtue of that, you do realize there's probably going to be a few people that do not engage with it at all.
I want to move to we do a quick fire round where we take questions from our audience, they can send them in on Twitter or Instagram at Politicon, or email them to us at podcasts@politicon.com. We have a few that are kind of, one specifically that's kind of related to what we're talking about. Cynthia from Boston specifically wanted to ask you, Nish, has satire become irrelevant?
I don't know. I don't think it's become irrelevant insofar as, I mean, I guess if I thought that, I would have to stop. So I guess I'm like professionally obliged to take a position against this. I think that, I think that for me, the sort of purpose of why we do comedy about politics, because, sometimes I do wake up and think, when you're like trying to write jokes and you're looking at Worldometer with the death counter and you're trying to like make some comedy out of it, you do think, Jesus, why don't we just write some nice, funny jokes about the differences between men and women? Why don't we just write some like, why are we doing this? But I think when I was a kid, the political comedy that I really loved had a way of making me, it didn't necessarily change my mind. It might have opened my mind up to new ideas. It might have helped me learn how to express something in a pithier way. But the main thing it did was make me feel better about scary subjects by making them feel ridiculous. And for me, that's the purpose, the continued purpose of satire. And that's why I'm such a fan of John Oliver and such a fan of The Daily Show. And, that's why I still go back to, Chris Rock stand-up specials, because for me, they had a way of taking something, whether it's, the rise of the far right, whether it's racism, whether it's the prospect of economic collapse, they had a way of taking those scary subjects and making them feel ridiculous, and so made me feel better for the bit of time that I was watching whatever it was.
And when people feel like they're not in control of a situation like that, certainly you have a few choices, but one of them is to stress out and get an ulcer and have incredibly life-altering anxiety, and another one is to laugh. And that's what, yeah, and totally. And, and the great thing about comedy that I've always felt is that you can watch comedy that totally takes you out of, I can't be the only person over the last few months that has like rewatched the whole of The Office, because like when things are scary, I want Steve Carell to be doing something goofy. Yeah. And feel comforted. I want to see Jim and Pam, make flirty eyes across an office with each other and know that it all ends up fine. And I feel reassured in that way. But I also, like to watch, comedy about the news. That's the nice thing about comedy, is that it can take something that's very specific and scary and make it feel less scary, or it can completely take you out of your reality. And both of those things are essential, and why I still love being a comedian and why I'm still such a fan of comedy. Well, speaking of ridiculous things that are somewhat funny, Luna from Twitter asks, do you think Kanye's entry into the campaign will hurt Vice President Biden, as he's openly admitted that it's the reason he's running?
The thing is, all I want is for somebody to just get Kanye into some therapy. And I'm not even saying that flippantly. I am really worried for him. I'm an unapologetic, massive fan of Kanye West. I'm concerned that he is not well. And I'm concerned that there is no one around him that seems to be intervening on his behalf. I don't think and I'm making a judgment call of the guy. I don't know him. I don't think Elon Musk should be anyone's support network. I just think that is not a good guy to have. Oh, don't worry, I'll be fine. My best buddy Elon is going to look after me when he's not trying to blast off into space. So I hope that.
Do you think Kanye will have an effect? Do you think he will have an effect in the states where he does get ballot access? Do you think that people will vote for him?
I don't think he'll do enough to split the vote. My instinct is that he won't do enough to split the vote, because I think, he's not going to be able, I think, to be on the ballot in all of the states. And I think there is too much of a sense of baggage with Kanye. And I think if he's specifically trying to split maybe the black vote, I think that is the area where he's going to fail, because but certainly in 2016, if you look at the sort of demographics, the black vote, and particularly the black female vote, was so overwhelming for the Democrats. And I can't see anything that's happened in the last 4 years is going to make those people change their mind about voting for the Democrats.
I do have a dinner bet with one of our producers that says that where he's concerned about it, and I told him that if Kanye gets more than 1% in any of the states he's on the ballot on, I'll owe him dinner. I kind of feel the same way as you do. I don't know that he's going to be able to. He's not this. I don't believe he'll necessarily be able to convince people to vote against Biden. I mean, if you're going to vote for Kanye West, he's already determined that he's and settled on the fact that he's probably not going to even be on the ballot in enough states to win the presidency, even if he won in every state he was on the ballot in. So you might as well vote for Trump if you're going to vote for Kanye. I think is probably the tack that a lot of people who are showing over to vote have. Mona from Chicago asks, are Britain and America still a force for good in the world?
I think it would be hard to make that case at the minute. But I would hope that in time we would be able to be a force for good. Again,
do you mean that in the sense that it's not setting the example that you would hope the two countries are not setting the example?
Well,
you would
just
hope,
sort of providing. You don't want to be a country that's held up by the far right in other countries as an example of how they can kind of take power. And that's the thing that concerns me. It concerns me that these kind of, we're such sort of, our power maybe is increasingly becoming, our actual geopolitical influence, I think, is on the wane. And certainly, in terms of like the coming powers of the century being China and India, and certainly while Putin is in charge, Russia as well. I think maybe geopolitically our powers might be on the wane, but we have a huge amount of, and this is such a woolly term by definition, but I think we have so much like soft cultural power still that I think I worry that we are, because of the the potency of the culture that we produce, I worry that that America particularly is sort of setting a bad cultural agenda. And certainly my concern is in Europe, what happened with Brexit. And again, you always take great pains to say, obviously not everyone voted Brexit was a racist, obviously not everyone who voted Brexit is, but the very fact of Brexit and the way it was agitated for and the way it was achieved feels like it's definitely given a shot in the arm to hard right-wing parties in Europe. Because, this was perceived as being a movement that was born out of the far right, regardless of the intricacies that we might be able to observe because we're actually in the country. The way that it was seen in the world was that this was a huge win for Nigel Farage, not really for Boris Johnson. This was seen as a huge win for Farage. And, Farage Farage was, I believe, and I don't know how this is not true, in violation of any number of COVID regulations, but he flew to Trump's rally about a month ago. And, so my concern is that we are both of our countries are setting a bad example and giving hope and inspiration to all the worst people.
Well, at the same time, I think we have to concede, and you've done that a little bit already too, that there are at least close to half of the people in the US and half of people in the UK who think
totally.
we're sort of UK's on the right track with Boris Johnson, that that Trump, despite all of his flaws, is doing a good job. And as we talked about a little bit too, all those people tend to be siloed into their Fox News viewing bubble or their Daily Mail reading bubble. So if we're continuing to silo ourselves politically, and then also as we're consuming our entertainment, watching Hello America or watching The Daily Show or watching Colbert or John Oliver or whatever, I guess there are some conservative comics too. If we're continuing to silo and only getting those messages that we're seeking out, the opinions that we agree with already, the question that we try to answer is, Nish Kumar, how the heck are we going to get along? Is there hope for us to actually come together and be able to communicate?
There's always hope, but I think that it's the challenge that faces the political leaders of the 21st century. And that challenge is, how do you get a message that cuts through? Ultimately, entertainment is great, but we aren't the change makers. All we can do is provide the entertainment to the people that show up to see us. It's the responsibility of political leaders to learn how to cut through the increasingly fractured way in which people get their information and animate people and shift minds and shift ideas. It's incumbent on political leaders to change the landscape. And that's the challenge, I think, that faces the kind of, coming generations of leaderships. And also it's a challenge for, and again, I'm talking specifically to the centre left and the left. It's a challenge to understand how to make it clear that actually, there's more people voted for Hillary Clinton than Donald Trump. Trump won effectively on a technicality. Similarly, in our last general election, more people voted for progressive left or centre-left parties, and also more people voted for parties that favoured a second Brexit referendum. But one of the things that Conservatives have been able to do is exploit the arcane nature of both of our electoral systems. I mean, we have the first past the post system, you have the electoral college, and both of them are sort of semi-outdated pieces of democratic equipment. And it is going to be about, in a Biden presidency, examining how that works. The electoral college is a hangover of a post-Civil War attempt to appease segregationist states in the South. Like, our first past the post system is an electoral system that came from a time where 3 people were allowed to vote because they owned the most land. There's sort of specific challenges facing, and it's about doing the boring grunt work when you're in power,
But if you change the electoral system in the UK or in the US, and yes, not only did Hillary Clinton win more votes, but it's not the first election in my lifetime where that's been the case.
Yeah,
Al Gore won more votes as well. So there's certainly an argument that it does not favor Democrats at the very least. But if you change that system and you move to a popular vote in the US, or you move to another sort of ranked choice voting in the UK, would that not just satisfy one particular side? I mean, the Electoral College, we have not seen in the U.S. an opportunity where Republicans were finding themselves on the losing end of the Electoral College system. So if we switched it to a popular vote, it would make the argument that Democrats wanted, that yes, we should, but it would just reverse the anger and put it on to conservatives who say this is not how we do it. So is that a way to really get people to get along and work together, or is that just switching the weight to the other side of the scale?
That's definitely not a way to encourage people to. That's definitely, but I think that's part and parcel of trying to make the machinery of executing democracy more actually democratic and more equitable and fair to the countries that you're trying to impose on. I mean, in terms of healing the rifts, I think that we need to somehow work out a way of re-establishing core principles, and some of those core principles have to include women and minorities should have the same rights as everybody else, and I think somehow we need to rebuild, well, maybe not even rebuild, because maybe that sense has never existed in the first place, but we need to get some basic democratic essentials, some basic core principles of a free and fair democratic country that transcend partisan politics. And I think the only way that is going to happen is if people on the right who don't consider themselves to be racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, misogynist, any of that, it's up to them to step back and say, we will no longer tolerate a system in which people's basic rights are a partisan issue. And it's finding a way, and it's finding a channel of communication that allows us to have those conversations. Because ultimately, we should be disagreeing over the size of the federal government. We should be disagreeing over, whether the state is very interventionist in the way the economy is run, or whether the state is not very we should be having these kind of idealized Aaron Sorkin West Wing episodes of conversations, because there are simply areas of political divergence that can only be that are just totally based on how you see the role of government and the role of the state.
Reasonable people can agree to disagree on.
Yeah, totally. There should be areas that reasonable people should be able to disagree on and should try and win an argument over. What we need to get away from is the idea that a woman's right to choose what happens to her body is a party political issue. We need to get away from the idea.
So what does the left need to do to help improve that too?
Well, I think what the left needs to do is make an unequivocal and clear case for those fundamental principles, and not equivocate on them. And I think there's been, certainly in Britain for a long time, there's too much a sort of equivocation on those principles. But also understand that part of a politician's job is to communicate and convince the people. It's no good being very left-wing and knowing that you're right if you can't explain that to an ordinary person. That is a fundamental failure of the role of a political leader. You can be as clever as you want and you can be as right as you want, but if you don't know how to make that case to an ordinary voter who isn't, because let's face it, people have a lot of stuff going on. People's ordinary lives, people like us are, this is professionally something that we're obliged to take an interest in. It's also something we find personally interesting. And, personally, I have the time to do that because of the nature of my lifestyle. I have the time to read the New York Times, and I have the time to read the Guardian newspaper in the UK. But, people working double shifts don't have the time to engage in the minutiae of politics. And so it's not just enough to be right. You have to explain to people why you're right. And we're not going to do that if we keep just going, why won't these people vote for us? We're so clever. That isn't going to work. And, I think about something like FDR's New Deal, and I think about it and the extent to which it was this incredible transformative social program that built the welfare state and our socialized medicine. And it's the same thing with the New Deal. So much of the building blocks of modern America happened under the presidency of FDR, but were able to do things like call it the New Deal. People still talk, we talk about a Green New Deal now because we understand that piece of rhetoric animated people and engaged them. And so we need to get to a position where the people with the good ideas can explain why their ideas are so good. Now, that's obviously going to be much more complicated because, there isn't a version of FDR's fireside chats that can kind of cut through the country in the same way. But the challenge for political leaders over the next 15, 20 years is to work out how to make their message cut through the fractious nature of the way that people currently communicate consume their political news and their entertainment.
Well, one of the fireside chat alternatives may very well be Hello America, Nish Kumar. The show is my very brief career in politics taught me how to plug, and make sure you get the plug in at all times. So I'll do that for you.
You're a savvier operator than me, Clay. No doubt about it.
So,
do you ever have
your
an interest
alternative?
Would you ever do it again?
I ran for a reason. I had a particular goal in mind. I wanted to make sure that the incumbent was seen in a very gerrymandered district, and that people would not just continue to vote for her without having to hear her speak. I made that possible. People saw her. She lost her next primary election. I feel like I played some role in that. I don't have a goal to go and run for office for the sake of running for office, but I'm not opposed to doing it if there's a reason. But wow. I do sometimes feel that there's ways to affect change, sometimes even more powerfully if you're not running for office, and you're doing that with your show, which I'm learning how to pivot back to. We'll do that. If you don't have Quibi, don't have Quibi already, you can get it. You can get it on the App Store on Apple. You can get it on the Google Play Store for Android phones. It's available online, obviously, and every week you can have a fireside chat with Nish Kumar, because I'll tell you, as someone who got to have a Corona quarantine side chat with him myself, it's worth having one. So Hello America comes out every week. You can listen to Nish there. And where else can we find you on Instagram and Twitter and all that stuff?
I'm Mr. Nish Kumar on in Twitter and Instagram, and I'm Nish Kumar Comedian on Facebook. And you're Hello America on Quibi. Hello America on Quibi. Thank you so much. This has been fun. This has been educational for me, and I think for a lot of people who are listening. And warnings from the UK that hopefully people will take heed of in this election year in the US too. So thank you so much. So subscribe, rate, and review, and then send your questions to us for next week's show. You can do that via Instagram or Twitter at Politicon, or you can email us at podcast@politicon.com. We'll be back next week with another guest to try to figure out how the heck are we going to get along.
What's up? I am Machine Gun Kelly, and look, I know Halloween is going to suck this year because there's no trick-or-treating and all that, but I've got a treat. There's a musical podcast that I made with my friends 24K Golden, Ian Dior, and Dana Dentata, and Satan. Well, Satan's not my friend, but Tommy Lee is, and Tommy Lee is playing Satan. But don't just take it from me. Tell him, Satan.
Thanks, dude. It feels great to be playing Satan on this podcast. Listen to Halloween in Hell on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or whatever you get your podcasts on.
13 Days of Halloween. A remote hotel, the most unusual guests, a tour guide that can't be trusted. And the newest arrival is you.
Why are you here again?
They sound like someone you trust.
I know you can hear me.
Starring Keegan-Michael Key as the caretaker.
Please make yourself at home. After all, this is it.
One story each night, starting October 19th and ending on Halloween. From iHeartRadio and Blumhouse Television, listen to Aaron Mahnke's 13 Days of Halloween on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.